phone needs to be charged.
Yeah. Do you need me to come in there and plug it in?
Yeah, I can't get to a cord.
Okay, I'll be there momentarily. Before I leave, let me just welcome everybody because we're streaming live right now, so we can't pause the video and run in there. Welcome to our Friday night Bible study, and I'll go get that taken care of so her phone doesn't run out of juice during this thing, and we'll come back and we'll get started. So please bear just a moment with us.
I'm sorry about that. Here, lift this and set the phone right there. Oh, you're going to put it there. All right. That'll work. Thank you. Can you hear me there?
We can hear you there, yes. Let me turn the volume back up. I started turning the volume down when we go live and I play the piano because I've noticed that the piano tends to distort if I have the microphone at full volume when I'm playing because it's louder and it is a ways away from me. So when I'm speaking and when my wife's speaking through the phone, we have to have it kind of cranked up. Been an eventful week. It was so cold this week here that we actually let the water dribble out of the kitchen faucet. The kitchen faucet is the water outlet farthest from the where the water comes in under the house. So that's the one. If we let that one drip, normally we don't have a problem with pipes freezing. Last year we forgot to do that a couple of times and ended up having to wait for the water to come out at the sink because it froze up there. The sink's right over an outside window, so that's not only the farthest away from the source of the water, but it's also right by the outside where it can get cold and freeze.
Oh, that any visiting Canadians actually may have put on some sweaters.
Okay. Well, at any rate, that was part of the week. Most of you are probably aware that there was another airline disaster this week. Also, a Bombardier CRJ aircraft flying from Minneapolis St. Paul, this time not to Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C., where the aircraft collided with a helicopter and crashed with the loss of life of everyone on board both aircraft. In this case, the plane was bound for Toronto's Pearson International Airport, where it crashed on landing and nobody died, which gives the Toronto Pearson Airport an interesting record because 10 or 15 years ago, an aircraft had a problem landing there and overran the runway, went off the end of the runway and down over an embankment where it caught fire. And still, because of the training of the cabin crew, they were able to get everybody off that airplane, and as I recall, without any loss of life, which was pretty amazing given the devastation and the post crash fire. And in this case, again, the training of the cabin crew contributed to getting everybody off that plane. That and the response of the fire department. The fire department got to the aircraft so fast that people were still exiting the aircraft at the time that the fire department started spraying foam on it. Now, another thing that helped to save the crew was that the right wing sheared off, and that's where the fuel was leaking and the fire started. But that wing, with less momentum, did not travel as far as the plane did down the runway, and therefore the bulk of the fire stayed with the wing where the fuel was, away from the fuselage and the passenger cabin of the aircraft, further ensuring that there was no loss of life, although there were injuries in that incident. A day or two afterward, a video came out that somebody had shot. I'm guessing they were somebody who likes to film landing aircraft. There are people who will live stream plane spotting, and this was clearly in a vehicle, but given the weather and the location, namely Toronto, Ontario, Canada, I'm not surprised that any plane spotters might actually be inside an automobile. In that video, you can clearly see that the plane came in for a landing. Just before it touched down, it began to pitch to the right so that the right landing gear touched down. And as far as I could tell, the left landing gear never did touch down. Instead, the left wing continued to go up. The right wing struck the runway and sheared off. And of course, then the fire started immediately once the fuel began to leave. And without the right wing, now only the left wing was providing any lift, so that just flipped the plane right on over until it was completely upside down when it came to rest. So one of the factors, of course, that helped save passengers is that airlines have required for years now that when it's time to land, passengers need to have their seatbelts fastened. So that way, even though the plane flipped upside down, the people were left suspended by their seatbelts. They weren't injured by falling and so forth. So, interesting event, and there were other events. My wife has a couple of times mentioned the trial in Massachusetts that ended in a mistrial, and now they're doing a retrial, and there's a bunch of hearings. And this week, they were holding a hearing, and the judge seemed to get flustered and upset. She called off the hearing. There's somebody who's produced a video that zoomed in on it. She was literally shaking, and I don't know if that's because of her age and medical condition, or if that was because of the situation. But at any rate, that has drawn a lot of attention through the rest of the week of the people who are following that case. So
She was presented with false evidence.
I heard something about Evans there, but I didn't pick up what you said.
She was presented with false evidence and lost her cool.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, people aren't sure exactly what she referred to because she made some comments about grave concerns and serious implications for the defense and the defense attorneys in the case, but she didn't say what, so there's been a lot of speculation what she referred to. The testimony that immediately preceded this was the prosecutor, who's actually a defense attorney, who's acting like a defense attorney in court, saying something about some information that he was unable to get from the federal government. The FBI has gotten involved in the case and hired a company to investigate, do some crash simulations to see if what the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was alleging was even possible. They came to the conclusion that it wasn't. The defense brought them in to testify at the trial. The judge was so upset about it, she would not let them say who hired them. So the jury ended up thinking that they were a company hired by the defendant's insurance company, which wasn't true at all. They didn't know that the federal government, the FBI, had hired these people. But at any rate, the federal government is still refusing to give the Commonwealth information that it wants about these experts and what's going on and so forth. And apparently, and this is only a possibility, the judge believed that the defense was refusing to give the Commonwealth this information. But what it turned out was that the defense had provided the emails in question to the prosecution. So they weren't guilty, apparently, of whatever it was the judge thought they were guilty of. And we don't know. There's a lot of things still up in the air on the whole thing.
prosecutor got up and clarified that he had misstated, but she still called off everything.
Well, whatever.
It's a real zoo, this whole thing.
That's life in a broken world with broken people who get into positions of power and think in terms of prestige and privilege and tradition instead of in terms of truth and reality.
It's history in the making. This
Yeah.
is real.
Yeah. Well, that's enough of that. You may have noticed in the titles on this that a few weeks back, when we were reading from the book of Judges, I talked about the old TV show British Men Behaving Badly and said that the book of Judges was Israelite men behaving badly. So I put as the subtitle on this, Israelite men committing murder. This is going to be a very bloody stretch as we read the first chapters of the book of 2 Samuel. So before we get into it, let's bow our heads and we'll officially begin. Our Father in heaven, thank you for your blessings. Thank you for safety and health and life over this past week. We thank you that you love us and that you have provided a way for us to escape the nonsense that is this life. We want to be part of your plan. We want to get to know you better. We want to learn to trust you more. And we know that in order for that to happen, we need to understand clearly who and what you are, what your character is like. And as we read the account of humans trying to come to grips with that, we know we're going to see a lot of very human things that are very negative. But we want the Holy Spirit to come and help us to see through all that, to see your goodness and purity of character. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we have up in Bible Gateway in the New Living Translation, you can't see it because my image covers where it says what the translation is, 2 Samuel chapter 1. Now, we finished last week at the end of 1 Samuel when it told the story of the death of Saul and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, David's good friend. The 3 of them died in battle on the same day. In Saul's case, he was injured by archers. Now, in most cases, we're going to read later in the Old Testament about a king who got injured by archers and got led aside, drove his chariot aside, and stood and watched the battle all day long and died when the battle was over, leading us to believe that had this person received anything like modern medical attention, the wounds would not have been fatal. And the wound that Saul received probably wasn't fatal. And so he asked his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer, probably appalled by the request, refused to do it. So Saul literally fell on his own sword, which is where we get the saying, to fall on one's own sword, to commit suicide when you've messed up. And so when Saul did that, then his armor bearer saw it and followed suit, did the same. And so Saul and his 3 sons, I should say 3 of his sons, because he does have others, died there on the hills of Gilboa. The Philistines found the bodies the next day, posted them on the wall of their city, and then the people of Jabesh Gilead, whom Saul had saved at the beginning of his reign, came to Bethshan, took the bodies back to their city, held proper mourning and ceremonies, and buried the bodies of Saul and his sons. Well, actually, they burned them and then buried the bones there in their own city. And if you've been paying attention to our sermon presentations, then you know what happened years later about that. But that's how that story ended. We also read about what happened to David, because David had joined the Philistine forces, and we even pondered what maybe David had in mind doing. But the Philistine says, he's Israelite, we're going to war against the Israelites, he shouldn't be with us. So he got sent away. He went back to his town of Ziklag, where he found that the Amalekites had raided and hauled off women and children and plunder. He went out after the Amalekites, defeated them, regained possession of the women, the children, and the plunder, and went back to Ziklag. So then when we get started here in 2 Samuel chapter 1, it tells us that after the death of Saul, David returned from his victory over the Amalekites and spent 2 days in Ziklag. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's army camp. He had torn his clothes and put dirt on his head to show that he was in mourning. He fell to the ground before David in deep respect. Now, this is a man who hasn't done his research, is what I'm going to say. He doesn't understand the character of David. He may not be aware of some of the stories that we're aware of, such as David at the cave of Adullam and David in Saul's camp at night, to understand the mindset of David. He thinks he's going to buy favor. He won't. Let's read on. "Where have you come from?" David asked. "I escaped from the Israelite camp," the man replied. "What happened?" David demanded. "Tell me how the battle went." Well, we didn't have social media or broadcast media or other forms of news in those days, so David hadn't yet heard what happened in that battle. So here comes somebody with news, so he asks him, "Tell me." The man replied, "Our entire army fled from the battle. Many of the men are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." "How do you know Saul and Jonathan are dead?" David demanded of the young man. The man answered, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa." That part is true. Well, at least we assume it's true, since we know that's where Saul died, and he said he happened to be there, that maybe he was. "And there was Saul leaning on his spear with the enemy chariots and charioteers closing in on him. When he turned and saw me, he cried out for me to come to him." Now, he may have seen what happened, given the story he's about to tell here. Listen. "How can I help?" I asked him. He responded, "Who are you?" "I'm an Amalekite," I told him. Then he begged me, "Come over here and put me out of my misery, for I am in terrible pain and want to die." "So I killed him," the Amalekite told David, "for I knew he couldn't live. Then I took his crown and his armband, and I have brought them here to you, my lord." Now, like I say, he may have been there. He may have seen Saul ask somebody to kill him, put him out of his misery. He didn't say it exactly that way. He said, "Lest these uncircumcised fellows come and abuse me," I think is an essence of what he was saying. But at any rate, he did ask somebody to kill him. The somebody he asked to kill him didn't kill him, so he fell on his own sword, quite literally. But this man is changing the story because he wants to get some attention. He wants to get credit. He wants to improve his situation before David by telling him that he had killed David's enemy. He figures this will stand him well in David's sight. Well, let's see what happened. David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard the news. They mourned and wept and fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the Lord's army and the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day. And then David said to the young man who had brought the news, "Where are you from?" And he replied, "I'm a foreigner, an Amalekite, who lives in your land." "Why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed one?" Recall, that's the language David has used repeatedly as he has refused to kill Saul. I am not going to kill the Lord's anointed one. Even though, at least according to Samuel, the Lord had rejected Saul. And according to the evidence, Saul was possessed to the extent that that might have been the case by an evil spirit who doesn't come from the Lord but comes from somebody else. So David asks him, all right, time for some accountability here. Why were you not afraid to do this thing? And then David said to one of his men, "Kill him." So the man thrust his sword into the Amalekite and killed him. "You have condemned yourself," David said, "for you yourself confessed that you killed the Lord's anointed one." Now, that strikes us as an injustice, because he didn't actually kill Saul. He only claimed to have killed Saul. David did not give him an opportunity to say, "Oh, but I lied. I didn't really do that." David took him at his word and issued the sentence, and one of his men carried it out immediately. That's why we have a due process and pay at least lip service to the concept of due process, that nobody can be deprived of liberty, property, or life without the opportunity to be heard and to tell his own side or her own side of the story. David simply said, "This is based on your own confession. You confess that you killed the Lord's anointed one," whether he did or not. I don't know if David knew. He may have suspected that the guy was just bragging, but at any rate. Then David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It is known as the Song of the Bow, and it is recorded in the book of Jashar. Footnote A, book of Jashar, or the book of the upright. In other words, should you transliterate or should you translate? Book of the upright would be a translation. Book of Jashar would be a transliteration, actually rendering the sounds of the original language in the letters of the target language. Your pride and joy, O Israel, lies dead on the hills. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Don't announce the news in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon. Gath and Ashkelon are both cities of the Philistines. Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the pagans will laugh in triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fruitful fields producing offerings of grain. Footnote B, meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. All right. For there the shield of the mighty heroes was defiled. The shield of Saul will no longer be anointed with oil. The bow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul did its mighty work, revealing the military and conflict mindset of the people of the time. They shed the blood of their enemies and pierced the bodies of mighty heroes. How beloved and gracious were Saul and Jonathan. Now it's interesting that he lumped Saul, the lunatic who wanted him dead, and Jonathan, the good friend, together here, and lauds them both. They were together in life and in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. O women of Israel, weep for Saul, for he dressed you in luxurious scarlet clothing, in garments decorated with gold. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies dead on the hills. How I weep for you, my brother Jonathan. Oh, how much I loved you. And your love for me was deep, deeper than the love of women. And that little turn of phrase has led people to suggest that there was something homosexual about the relationship between David and Jonathan. But he isn't likening it to the love of women. He's saying it was even deeper than that. David would have many wives in his lifetime.
Remember not to look at it through the lens of our culture.
Exactly. Women were, and this is going to sound crass, but from David's perspective, women were a dime a dozen. They were all singing his praises. They were all agog over him. Saul's daughter had fallen in love, in infatuation with him. So if David wanted a woman, he could have a woman. But he only had one friend like Jonathan, and he had lost that friend. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen, stripped of their weapons, they lie dead. And so ends David's funeral poem for Saul and Jonathan. And thus also ends chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. After this, David asked the Lord, "Should I move back to one of the towns of Judah?" "Yes," the Lord replied. Recall that, I can't remember his name right now. I think it's Abiathar, or was it his son? I'd have to go back and look. One of the priests had joined David and had taken the ephod with him, and David used that to inquire. Abiathar, yeah, that's the name. Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech. Ahimelech and his family are the ones who died, except for Abiathar, who escaped and fled to David. So it was Abiathar who had brought the ephod with him. And it was how David was inquiring of God at this point. Well, then David asked, "Which town should I go to?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. David's two wives were Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel. Now, that means that up to this point, according to the record anyway, David has had three wives, because his first wife was Michal, daughter of Saul. After David fled, Saul sent his daughter to be the wife of somebody else. We're not told the story of how David met Ahinoam or anything about her other than she appears to be his first wife after Michal, and then there was Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel. So David and his wives and his men and their families all moved to Judah, and they settled in the villages near Hebron. Then the men of Judah came to David and anointed him king over the people of Judah. Now, whether this was Judah, Benjamin, and a half-tribe of Manasseh, as it would be in the future, or whether this was just Judah, isn't clear at this point, but at least Judah chose David, a member of their own tribe, as their king. When David heard that the men of Jabesh Gilead had buried Saul, he sent them this message: "May the Lord bless you for being so loyal to your master Saul and giving him a decent burial. May the Lord be loyal to you in return and reward you with his unfailing love. And I too will reward you for what you have done. Now that Saul is dead, I ask you to be my strong and loyal subjects, like the people of Judah, who have anointed me as their new king." Now recall that Jabesh Gilead is part of the Transjordan territory. It's the part east of the Jordan River that the Israelites took as they were arriving at the Promised Land in the days of Moses and Joshua. Now David is reaching out to the people in this territory through Jabesh Gilead to get them to accept him as their king. But Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had already gone to Mahanaim with Saul's son Ishbosheth. Mahanaim is also in the Transjordan territory. And here's another son, and we talked about this name in a sermon presentation a few weeks back. Ishbosheth, let's see what the footnote says about that. Ishbosheth is another name for Eshbaal. All right? Or Baal has spoken, something like that is what I recall. At any rate, there will be more than one person named Ishbosheth. This is Saul's son, Ishbosheth. And Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, takes him, and it says, there he proclaimed Ishbosheth king over Gilead, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and the land of the Asherites, and all the rest of Israel. So David is setting himself up as king in Judah, but Abner is setting Saul's son up as king in Saul's place over most of the rest of Israel. Now, I learned something interesting this week, and I'm not sure about this. I was doing some crosswords, and I ran across a couple of Bible crosswords. And one of the clues was Saul's grandfather. Now, Saul, we might recall, was the son of Kish. But it turns out that Kish was the son of Ner, N-E-R. And that leads us to wonder, given the nepotism that was so common at the time, I mean, we know that David is going to put his nephew in charge of his army, so why should not Saul have put his uncle in charge of his army? And in fact, Ner might have had sons over a fairly long period of time, so that Abner was a lot closer to Saul's age than he was to Kish's age. And yet, now, just a possibility, we can't be positive, but he may well have been Saul's uncle because he's the son of Ner, as was Kish. At any rate, we've got this conflict now set up because David is king over Judah. The people of Judah have chosen him and named him, but Abner has set up Ishbosheth to be king over the rest of Israel. And it appears that the people have kind of agreed with this. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king, and he ruled from Mahanaim for 2 years. Now that's an interesting thing because that's going to give us a timeline for the events that are going to take place. Meanwhile, the people of Judah remained loyal to David. David made Hebron his capital. That's going to be significant in future. And he ruled as king of Judah for 7.5 years. We'll talk about that later. I think we mentioned that to some extent in our sermon presentation about later events in the life of David. But at this point, Hebron's his capital, and he rules there for 7.5 years. Now, Ishbosheth ruled, it says, for only 2 years. And as we read this, we'll look at what happened. So it is likely that there's maybe roughly 5 years that David stayed in Hebron after he got control of the entire kingdom. At any rate, it says, one day Abner led Ishbosheth's troops from Mahanaim to Gibeon. About the same time, Joab, son of Zeruiah, led David's troops out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. So now we have the two Israelite generals, Abner in charge of Saul's troops, and Joab in charge of David's troops. They both go to Gibeon, and there they meet at a pool. The two groups sat down there, facing each other from opposite sides of the pool. If you are sensitive, you might want to ignore this next little bit of story. Then Abner suggested to Joab, let's have a few of our warriors fight hand to hand here in front of us. All right, Joab agreed. So 12 men were chosen to fight from each side. 12 men of Benjamin representing Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 representing David. Each one grabbed his opponent by the hair and thrust his sword into the other side so that all of them died. So this place at Gibeon has been known ever since as the Field of Swords, or footnote B, Helkath Hazur is the Hebrew for Field of Swords there.
Well, I hate to sound crass. I hate that story. I hate that they acted like that. But whoever was responsible for that should have met the same fate because of their culture and their waste of resources.
And who was responsible?
Wasn't it did you say Abner and Joab?
That's who it was. Abner suggested it. Joab agreed. They sent the men out, and 24 men died. And it didn't decide a thing. It didn't make any difference at all, other than now both sides are 12 men short. Joab.
Entertainment.
What did you say?
Is that for entertainment?
Well, it does kind of sound like it. The both sides are sitting on opposite sides of the pool, staring each other down, and they say, "Here, let's have some fun."
Yeah, barbarians.
Yeah. Like I say, Israelite men committing murder.
Now, is this God looking favorably upon their behavior or them as a people? Because of who they could be, who they are, and what they could become if they will allow it.
Well, notice that the narrator here draws no moral conclusions, makes no moral judgments. He simply... What?
He may have thought this was a perfectly normal behavior.
Well, he might have, he might not have, but he doesn't comment on it. He just lays out the bare bones of what happened.
Yeah, because it's no big deal. He's from that culture.
Yeah. Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, the three sons of Zeruiah, all of them David's nephews, were among David's forces that day. Asahel could run like a gazelle, and he began chasing Abner. He pursued him relentlessly, not stopping for anything. When Abner looked back and saw him coming, he called out, "Is that you, Asahel?" Now, this is probably pretty breathless conversation since they're both running, but "Yes, it is," he replied. "Go fight someone else," Abner warned. "Take on one of the younger men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel kept right on chasing Abner. What was he thinking? I'm talking about Asahel here. Well, I suppose he's thinking that if he can kill Abner, he'll get the congratulations of David and get a better position in the army when David hears that he has essentially executed David's enemy, Abner. Of course, we're going to find out how David responded when Abner was in fact assassinated, but we haven't got there yet. But Asahel kept right on chasing Abner, wouldn't quit. Again, Abner shouted to him, "Get away from here. I don't want to kill you. How could I ever face your brother Joab again?" So apparently Abner knows that Joab's the big shot. He knows that Asahel is his brother. And he says, "I don't want to have to kill you, because then Joab's going to be mad at me." But Asahel refused to turn back, so Abner thrust the butt end of his spear through Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He stumbled to the ground and died there, and everyone who came by that spot stopped and stood still when they saw Asahel lying there. So, this is a case of David's forces chasing Saul's forces, Joab chasing Abner. And when Asahel would not turn back, then Abner took the defensive action that the situation and the culture enforced on him, dispatched his pursuer, and fled. When Joab and Abishai found out what had happened, they set out after Abner. The sun was just going down as they arrived at the hill of Ammah near Giah, along the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. Abner's troops from the tribe of Benjamin regrouped there at the top of the hill to take a stand. Abner shouted down to Joab, "Must we always be killing each other? Don't you realize that bitterness is the only result? When will you call off your men from chasing their Israelite brothers?" And then Joab said, "God only knows what would happen if you hadn't spoken, for we would have chased you all night if necessary." So Joab blew the ram's horn, and his men stopped chasing the troops of Israel. All that night, Abner and his men retreated through the Jordan Valley. They crossed the Jordan River, traveling all through the morning, and didn't stop until they arrived at Mahanaim. Footnotes C and D, the Arabah, as opposed to the Jordan Valley, and then or continued on to the Bithron, the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. Meanwhile, Joab and his men also returned home. When Joab counted his casualties, he discovered that only 19 men were missing in addition to Asahel. But 360 of Abner's men had been killed, all from the tribe of Benjamin. Joab and his men took Asahel's body to Bethlehem and buried him there in his father's tomb. Then they traveled all night and reached Hebron at daybreak. So apparently 12 men died. We know that 12 of the men died in that ridiculous battle of 12 on 12. So then there would have been 8 more, if you count Asahel, that died in the ensuing battle, whereas 348 men, in addition to the 12 of Abner's, were killed in the ensuing battle. Far too many deaths, but in terms of warfare, a rather low casualty count. Chapter 3. That was the beginning of a long war between those who were loyal to Saul and those loyal to David. As time passed, David became stronger and stronger, while Saul's dynasty became weaker and weaker. Now, how long did this take? Well, it's not clear. It's not clear at what point Abner quit trying to support Ishbosheth, except that it was shortly after Ishbosheth's death, and we'll get to that story in a little bit. But the narrative has told us that Ishbosheth reigned for 2 years. So his death was probably at the end of those 2 years, which is 2 years after the death of his father Saul and his brothers Jonathan and the other two. And so that's why I say that David's time at Hebron was probably about 5 years after he got control of the entire country. David's sons born in Hebron. Now this is interesting, and we'll take a little time to look at it and to make some deductions. These are the sons who were born to David in Hebron. The oldest was Amnon, whose mother was Ahinoam from Jezreel. Remember earlier we read about his two wives, Ahinoam and Abigail. So David's oldest son is not from Michal, but from Ahinoam, and David named him Amnon. The second was Daniel, whose mother was Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel. The third was Absalom, whose mother was Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. Now, if David married the daughter of a king, that means he was probably trying to cement an alliance and treaty with that country, Geshur. And that was how they did it. So, we're going to see 6 sons. We're also going to see 6 wives. So we have Ahinoam, Abigail, and Maacah. So far, the sons were Amnon, Daniel, and there's a footnote there. That's not the name we normally know him by. The Hebrew actually reads Kiliab. Now they say they're rendering as in a parallel text in 1 Chronicles 3:1. See also the Greek version, which reads Daluya, and possible support by the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the original Hebrew that we have reads Kiliab, and that's the name by which we normally know him. Now, we've got 3, and we're about to read about a 4th son. There are 6 here. And we're going to talk about what happens to each of these. The 4th was Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith. So 3 of the 4 sons had names beginning with A. The 5th was Shephatiah, whose mother was Abital. The 6th was Ithream, whose mother was Eglah, David's wife. Well, we would assume that all of them were wives or concubines of David, because they're all David's sons. Now, normally, kingship would transfer from father to oldest son. So, in this setup, the first one in line to be king after David is Amnon. But if you know the story, you know Amnon didn't get there. He was murdered. He was murdered by Absalom, the 3rd son. Absalom was killed by Joab when Absalom tried to name himself king. And then when we get to 1 Kings and read the story of Solomon, the one who actually did succeed David, he ends up murdering Adonijah over a potential claim to the throne. Now, Adonijah is the 4th son. So, out of these 4 sons, we know what happened to 3 of them. Amnon, killed by Absalom, who was then killed by Joab, all over about the same thing. So, those 2 weren't in the running. Adonijah considers himself in the running when David dies and takes steps that Solomon interprets as seeking to become king, and so he dies there. But what happened to the second one? Why is there no mention of him except here, Kiliab or Daniel, whichever name you want to use for him? But recall that it says here, whose mother was Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel. And then recall the tradition of the time, that if a man died and did not have any descendants, Then the man's brother was to marry the widow and have a son by the widow, who would then be legally considered the son of the deceased. Now, granted, David was not Nabal's brother, but he did marry Nabal's widow. And it stands to reason then that Daniel or Kiliab, whichever name you want to assign to him, would be considered the heir of Nabal from Carmel. And we know Nabal was a rich man. So Daniel had an inheritance waiting for him and a household to become the head of once he came of age in Carmel. And so that was his destiny, not a destiny as the son of David. Therefore, he was not in line to become king, and that's why there's no mention of him further on, because he wasn't in the picture like the others were. Now, of course, we don't also read about either Shephatiah or Ithream. They don't appear in the narrative again, but they're here. Since Adonijah does appear in the narrative, we know that he at least considered that he was next in line to be king, since the other three were already out of the picture. And then, of course, it concludes the thing by saying these sons were all born to David in Hebron. As the war between the house of Saul and the house of David went on, Abner became a powerful leader among those loyal to Saul. One day, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, accused Abner of sleeping with one of his father's concubines, a woman named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. Rizpah, as we know from the sermon presentation earlier, but later in the story, will appear again. There's a footnote there, footnote B for Ishbosheth, just says the same thing it did before, another name for Eshbaal. All right, so we continue then at verse 8. Now let's stop and think about why Ishbosheth would be upset about this. I mean, Rizpah was essentially a stepmother. And not even really a stepmother, because she wasn't a wife, she was just a concubine. But she was close enough to a wife that Ishbosheth interpreted Abner's alliance with this woman as an attempt by Abner to take over and become king. Because the culture of the time was, if you had the king's wife, then you could be king. And in fact, when we get to the story of Adonijah, that'll be exactly the issue. The issue will come up in the story of Michael as well. So, Ishbosheth gets the impression, whether right or wrong, I don't think we're told, that Abner has had relations with one of his father's concubines, and he sees it as a treasonous act, and he makes an accusation. And now Abner is furious. Am I some Judean dog to be kicked around like this? He shouted. After all I have done for your father Saul and his family and friends, by not handing you over to David, is this my reward, that you find fault with me about this woman? Now, Ishbosheth's accusation may have been true because Abner doesn't deny it. He just says, is this how you're going to act? I am the one who set you up as king. I served your father. I did not hand you over to David. This is how you're going to treat me? And then he goes on, may God strike me and even kill me if I don't do everything I can to help David get what the Lord has promised him. I'm going to take Saul's kingdom and give it to David. I will establish the throne of David over Israel as well as Judah, all the way from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. Ishbosheth didn't dare say another word because he was afraid of what Abner might do. Well, Abner was a violent man. We've already seen that. He might well be afraid. He didn't have the personal power, and he didn't have the political power to hold Abner in control. If Abner decides he doesn't like Ishbosheth, there's not much Ishbosheth can do about it. Then Abner sent messengers to David saying, "Doesn't the entire land belong to you? Make a solemn pact with me, and I will help turn over all of Israel to you." "All right," David replied, "but I will not negotiate with you unless you bring back my wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come." David then sent this message to Ishbosheth, Saul's son: "Give me back my wife Michal, for I bought her with the lives of 100 Philistines." Now I'm going to guess that footnote there is going to tell us that the Hebrew was a little bit more
graphic.
Yeah, exactly. I'm looking at the note. Hebrew says the foreskins. So it's very explicit about what David was saying here. So he sends this note to Ishbosheth and says, "Get your sister back for me. She's my wife. I bought her. I deserve her back." Now, why would he be doing this? Did he particularly love her? I mean, we've already read he has at least 6 wives. Why is he asking for another one? But then recall what we said about having the wife of the king. Michal had been David's wife. This Paltiel, we're going to see his name in a minute here, might have been able to claim the throne because he had David's wife. And so David, understanding the culture, says to Abner and then to Ishbosheth, "I need this woman back." So Ishbosheth took Michal away from her husband Palti, footnote D. The Hebrew reads Paltiel, a variant spelling of Palti. That's why I had said Paltiel, because I'm reading it from versions that render it that way. Palti followed along behind her as far as Bahurim, weeping as he went. "Hey, you're taking away my wife! You can't take her!" Then Abner told him, "Go back home." So Palti returned. Meanwhile, Abner had consulted with the elders of Israel. "For some time now," he told them, "you have wanted to make David your king. Now is the time. For the Lord has said, I have chosen David to save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from all their other enemies." Abner also spoke with the men of Benjamin. Then he went to Hebron to tell David that all the people of Israel and Benjamin had agreed to support him. When Abner and 20 of his men came to Hebron, David entertained them with a great feast. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go and call an assembly of all Israel to support my lord the king. They will make a covenant with you to make you their king, and you will rule over everything your heart desires." So David sent Abner safely on his way. it's interesting. It doesn't appear that David was at all suspicious. And it is entirely possible that, while it's not told here, David knows the history between Ishbosheth and Abner and knows why Abner has had this change of heart and is now willing to assist David in taking control of the entire nation. And so David accepts the offer of help. David does, but not everybody does. But just after David had sent Abner away in safety, Joab and some of David's troops returned from a raid, bringing much plunder with them. When Joab arrived, he was told that Abner had just been there visiting the king and had been sent away in safety. Now, Joab's going to act like a character out of the Wild West. You kill my brother, you're not getting away with it. You kill my brother, now I'm going to kill you. Joab rushed to the king and demanded, "What have you done? What do you mean by letting Abner get away? You know perfectly well that he came to spy on you and find out everything you're doing." Well, whoever wrote this down doesn't seem to think that was the case. David didn't seem to think that was the case. And from what we can tell, that wasn't the case. Abner wasn't there to spy. He was genuinely there to help David take control of the entire nation of Israel. Joab then left David and sent messengers to catch up with Abner, asking him to return. They found him at the well of Sirah and brought him back, though David knew nothing about it. When Abner arrived back at Hebron, Joab took him aside at the gateway as if to speak with him privately. But then he stabbed Abner in the stomach and killed him in revenge for killing his brother Asahel. So the narrator here is very explicit about why Joab killed Abner. But we have in the past discussed it and considered the possibility that Joab was insecure in the presence of Abner. He may have believed that Abner was a better general than he himself, Joab, was, and that if Abner joined David, Abner might become David's chief commander, replacing Joab, and that Joab's murder of Abner was the murder of a potential rival. And I think,
However, looking forward into the future, what led to the death of Joab?
Well, we'll read that when you get to the story of Solomon, because Solomon is the one who will order his execution.
Yeah, and why?
Don't remember. Shall I go look?
Didn't he, one of David's sons claimed to be, there's a coup and one of David's sons claimed to take over, and didn't Joab side with the son?
No.
Again?
No, Joab stuck with David when Absalom rebelled. And Joab is the one who killed Absalom against David's express orders.
Well, I'm confused. I remember it that Joab. All right. Somebody was with Absalom that. Well, I guess I don't know what I'm talking about. I'll be quiet.
Well, we did a sermon presentation a number of years ago about that issue, and I speculated there that Joab's murder of Absalom was motivated very similar of a very similar motive to what motivated him to kill Abner. Now Absalom hadn't killed one of Joab's brothers, but if Absalom became king, Joab wouldn't be commander of the troops anymore. So if he kills Absalom, then he's certain that Absalom won't become king, and he serves to cement his position. Okay, here's where you're right. And I'm reading ahead in 1 Kings chapter 2. Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood. Remember, Abiathar is the survivor of the house of Ahimelech, who fled to David and served David for the rest of his life, essentially. Now Solomon says, you can't be priest anymore, and he removed Abiathar from the priesthood. And 1 Kings 2, chapter 27 says, fulfilling the word the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. Now when the news reached Joab, who had conspired with Adonijah, though not with Absalom, he fled to the tent of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. King Solomon was told that Joab had fled to the altar of the Lord and was beside the altar. Then Solomon ordered Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, go strike him down. So Benaiah entered the tent of the Lord and said to Joab, the king says, come out. But he answered, no, I will die here. Benaiah reported to the king, this is how Joab answered me. Then the king commanded Benaiah, do as he says, strike him down and bury him, and so clear me and my father's house of the guilt of the innocent blood that Joab shed. So there was an element of his conspiring with Adonijah that led to Joab's execution at the command of Solomon. Yes.
Yeah.
So you weren't entirely off. It wasn't Absalom. It was Adonijah. So we've gotten to now essentially the assassination of Abner by Joab. When David heard about it, he declared, I vow by the Lord that I and my kingdom are forever innocent of this crime against Abner, son of Ner. Joab and his family are the guilty ones. May the family of Joab be cursed in every generation with a man who has open sores or leprosy, or who walks on crutches, or dies by the sword, or begs for food. Footnotes E and F. Contagious skin disease, the Hebrew word used here can describe various skin diseases. And then the Hebrew reads, who handles a spindle, or who is effeminate. And that is for walks on crutches. Oh, well, all right. The point is, David is pronouncing a curse on the family of Joab. Now, one wonders, why didn't he say, all right, Joab, you killed an innocent man, you can no longer be in charge of my army? I mean, look at what he did to the man who only claimed to have killed Saul. Why didn't he deal with Joab in the same way?
Are you speaking of David or Solomon?
David.
David was afraid of Joab.
Well, it does appear that Joab had some level of power, because there's another place in which David will say, you sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. I think that's in the story of Absalom where we read that. So there was an imbalance of power here that made it possible for Joab to get away with some things that he shouldn't have been allowed to get away with, including killing Abner. So Joab and his brother Abishai killed Abner because Abner had killed their brother Asahel at the Battle of Gibeon. And if they had just read the story, they would have known that Abner didn't have a choice, that he didn't want to kill Abishai. I mean Asahel. He was essentially forced to by Asahel's uh, stubbornness, essentially.
It may be a case of he knew that he didn't have a choice, but it didn't matter because Joab was simply looking for a reason to justify killing the guy.
Well, that's very likely, yes. Then David said to Joab and all those who were with him, tear your clothes and put on burlap or sackcloth. Mourn for Abner. And King David himself walked behind the procession to the grave. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king and all the people wept at his graveside. Then the king sang this funeral song for Abner. So he's already done one for Saul and Jonathan. Now he does one for Abner. Should Abner have died as fools die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not chained. No, you were murdered, the victim of a wicked plot. All the people wept again for Abner. David had refused to eat anything on the day of the funeral, and now everyone begged him to eat. But David had made a vow saying, may God strike me and even kill me if I eat anything before sundown. This pleased the people very much. In fact, everything the king did pleased them. So everyone in Judah and all Israel understood that David was not responsible for Abner's murder. And then King David said to his officials, don't you realize that a great commander has fallen today in Israel? And even though I am the anointed king, these two sons of Zeruiah, Joab and Abishai, are too strong for me to control. I guess I misspoke, didn't I? It's right here. They're too strong for him. So may the Lord repay these evil men for their evil deeds. And it looks like we have...
And he was a relative. Had David taken any action against him, he would have had his family to deal with.
Well, that's true. I mean, they were his nephews. He would have had his sister and his brother-in-law at his throat if he had done something about them. Family drama.
Toxic family.
When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard about Abner's death at Hebron, he lost all courage and all Israel became paralyzed with fear. Now, there were two brothers, Baanah and Rechab, who were captains of Ishbosheth's raiding parties. They were sons of Rimmon, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, who lived in Beeroth. The town of Beeroth is now part of Benjamin's territory because the original people of Beeroth fled to Gittaim, where they still live as foreigners. Now, Saul's son Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth who was crippled as a child. He was 5 years old when the report came from Jezreel that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle. When the child's nurse heard the news, she picked him up and fled. But as she hurried away, she dropped him, and he became crippled. Well, that's a parenthetical note there that will come into the picture later, but it's plugged in here so that we'll know what's going on. Mephibosheth, footnote B, is another name for Merib-Baal. So we have Eshbaal and now Merib-Baal. So Ishbosheth, Mephibosheth, similar. So, and this is a short chapter, so we shouldn't have any trouble getting through it here. One day, Rechab and Baanah, the sons of Rimmon from Beeroth, went to Ishbosheth's house around noon as he was taking his midday rest. The doorkeeper, who had been sifting wheat, became drowsy and fell asleep. So Rechab and Baanah slipped past her. Now, there's a footnote there, as in the Greek version. The Hebrew reads, so they went into the house pretending to fetch wheat. So there are different versions of the particular story. The point is they got in there. They went into the house and found Ishbosheth sleeping on his bed. They struck and killed him and cut off his head. Then, taking his head with him, they fled across the Jordan Valley through the night. That footnote D is probably the same thing, the Arabah. Okay, yeah. When they arrived at Hebron, well, of course, if Ishbosheth was still at Mahanaim, they would have had to cross the Jordan to get to Hebron. When they arrived at Hebron, they presented Ishbosheth's head to David. Look, they exclaimed to the king, here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of your enemy Saul, who tried to kill you. Today the Lord has given my lord the king revenge on Saul and his entire family. Now, you're probably smart enough to know, wait a minute, what are these guys thinking? Did they not hear the story of the Amalekite who claimed to have killed Saul? These two are not claiming to have killed Ishbosheth. They have his head with them to prove that they, in fact, were guilty of Ishbosheth's assassination. But David said to Rechab, Baanah, the Lord who saves me from all my enemies is my witness. Someone once told me Saul is dead, thinking he was bringing me good news. But I seized him and killed him at Ziklag. That's the reward I gave him for his news. How much more should I reward evil men who have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed? Shouldn't I hold you responsible for his blood and rid the earth of you? So David ordered his young men to kill them, and they did. They cut off their hands and feet and hung their bodies beside the pool in Hebron. Then they took Ishbosheth's head and buried it in Abner's tomb in Hebron. Doesn't tell us what happened to the body. It probably got buried in Mahanaim, where he was murdered. So there we have 4 chapters of Israelite men committing murder. And it's not here to tell us what people should or shouldn't do. It's here to tell us what people did, to give us an accurate account of the history, so that we can be appalled at the terrible things that sin does to the human race. The race that should have operated on the basis of love. The race that should have cooperated in everything. Instead, is busy killing each other and making incorrect assumptions and being toxic, even though they are members of a nation chosen by God to bear his image. They're not really bearing his image, are they? And so we have this story. Now, we know, because we'll read it in the next chapter, I believe, that this did not end the war between David and Saul. This is roughly 2 years into David's 7.5 year stay at Hebron. How much longer that war would last is not clear. It doesn't tell us. But it's going to last a little bit longer, and it's going to claim more lives, though perhaps they're not explicitly named as they have been named so far. So, looking at the time, it's a little bit short than what we normally would do, but we went long, I think, the last two times. So I think it's appropriate for us to cut this a little bit short. Besides, we're doing this live, which we don't normally do. So I think at this time, since we're at the end of another chapter, chapter 4, right? Where's the tie? Yeah, 2 Samuel chapter 4. We finished chapter 4. We'll pick up chapter 5 next week. Now, next week will be the 28th. I didn't say it before, but this is for Friday, the 21st of February. So a week from now will be the 28th of February, the last day. So the following Saturday will be the first day of March. And it is our plan to prepare a sermon presentation and to present it, to make it available to you about 11 o'clock Central Time on the 1st of March, Saturday. Again, we don't say that's what we're going to do. We say, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. That's our plan. So until next week, we say goodbye and God bless.